So I got a request a few days ago to cover projectiles, and I'm working on Into the Omega right now, one of my mods. And I have an item I've been working on called the Matrix Bomb, which is basically just a little thrown grenade. Right now all it does is play sound when you click with it. I've got the item class right here, as you can see in the use method, which actually should probably have an override annotation there. We just play a sound when we use the item, increment some stats, and then right here is where we'd actually spawn, if we look at maybe the snowball item, where we'd spawn the entity. And so I'm going to find my entity package, and I'm going to create an entity for this. Now, one thing you need to know going into this is the difference between the entity classes. So base class for entity is entity. That covers things like position, velocity, and other properties. Then after entity comes living entity, which is any entity that has health. To clarify, base entities are things like experience orbs, where you can't really kill them, they're just there. Living entities are things like creepers or players. One other thing you need to know, then, after that, is projectile entity. Projectile entity directly extends entity, and there are a few different classes then that extend projectile entity. For example, thrown entity, there's potion entity, fishing bobber entity. I think there's a thrown item entity. So you can either extend projectile entity or one of the subclasses. One thing to note is that projectile entity doesn't actually implement movement. I think it has velocity, but it doesn't do anything with that. So if you summon your projectile and it's only extending projectile entity, it's just going to sit there. For this, I'm going to be using thrown entity because thrown entity directly extends projectile entity, and in its inside its tick method, it uses its velocity here to update its position right here. So we don't have to actually worry about that ourselves. So I'm going to have my matrix bomb entity class extend thrown entity, and it wants us to override a few methods here. We've got init data tracker, and that's for, gotta get some water here, one sec. Excuse me, that's for tracking data from server to client. So I'm trying to think of an entity that uses it. I want to say the Wither Skull entity. Yeah, so Wither Skulls can be charged or not charged, and the client needs to know about this because they render differently depending on that property. So this is kind of like MBT, where you'd sync that from server to client in the block entity. This is how standard entities do it. So we're not actually going to touch this because I don't have anything I need to sync from server to client related to the actual entity data. I'm going to make this constructor public. Now I'm going to go over to my entity registry class. I just have some standard helper registry methods here. This is a projectile, so I'm going to say its spawn group is miscellaneous, and then I should just be able to method reference the constructor here and set the dimensions to, let's do 0.25, 0.25, and I'm going to build that. All seems to be well. Next thing we need, because this is an entity, we need a entity renderer. So I'm going to say matrix bomb entity renderer, and that's just going to extend entity renderer, and the generic for that is our matrix bomb. Get texture is for if you're rendering like biped entity renderer. Is there a render for that? I'm trying to find an example of where that comes into play. Cow entity renderer. So like in the cow entity renderer, it passes up the cow texture, which is then attached to this cow entity model right here. Because I'm not using a model, I'm just going to return null. Don't have to touch that. Instead, inside my render method, I'm going to grab the Minecraft client instance and get the item renderer, and then I'm going to render a stack where my entity is. Let's render that stack. I want to use the second constructor here. I think we need light, and then UV. It's UV something. It's like default UV. Yes, there we go. Overlay texture, default UV, and then it wants a matrix stack and vertex consumer provider, which the method gives us. So this right here, every render frame, it will render a TNT item stack where the entity is. And of course, we need to register this, so we head over to our client initializer, which is very messy in my project. Just going to call entity register registry, instance register, and I have my entity here. That is the matrix bomb. Matrix bomb entity renderer, and that wants the dispatcher from this factory here. So we've registered our entity renderer, which means the game can launch now. If you don't register an entity renderer, your game will crash because you have to do that. Now, one thing you need to know, and this is kind of where projectiles are tricky, and this is the entire reason we're doing the video. I mean, if this wasn't an issue, nobody would really have trouble with it, but it is an issue. So, living entities. If you create a living entity, it is automatically synced from the server to the client. So you don't have to do anything related to like telling the client that the entity is spawned. The game handles that. For whatever amazing reason, base entities are not synced. So client play, I think it's client play network handler is where the game syncs vanilla entities. And as you can see, it is a giant conditional spaghetti mess where every single base entity, well, every entity in the game that directly extends, or is not living entity, that's a better way to put it, is inside one of these conditionals here. So, command block minecart, it checks specifically if the entity type coming in from the packet, this is on the client side, by the way, server spawns the entity, goes to the client, says, hey, an entity just spawned, and that entity, then the client figures it out, oh, it's a command block minecart, and goes and spawns one like specifically, right? So there's no abstraction for that for whatever reason, but living entities do automatically sync. So what this means is that if you create a projectile entity and you don't sync it yourself, and you log into the game and you spawn that entity, it will not appear because the client just doesn't know it exists. So what we have to do back in our matrix bomb entity class is override the create spawn packet method. First thing we're going to do is create a packet. Unpooled.buffer, that basically means it'll dynamically resize itself based on what you put in, from my understanding. We need to save 5 things, really 3 things to this packet. Entity position, and entity ID, and UUID. So I'm going to do packet right double, get X. We're writing our X position to this packet, writing our Y position to the packet, and our Z position to the packet. By the way, create spawn packet, again, called on the server. This is to prepare a packet to send from server to client to let the client know, hey, an entity just spawned. Other thing we have to do is save the entity ID that helps the server and client agree on which entity is which. And honestly, I'm not really sure if you have to sync UUID. I usually do it, and I haven't had any issues with it. So I would recommend it. And then we're going to send this through Fabric's packet system. So we call server-side packet registry toPacket. We need to pass in an identifier that identifies our packet. So I'm going to create one at the top of my entity class here called spawn packet, and I have a utility method for creating identifiers. I'm just going to call it matrix bomb. We're going to pass that spawn packet in. By the way, we put it up here so that we can access it in another area later on. So don't just make it down here. And then we want our packet, which we just created earlier. So this is on the server. Now we need to handle it on the client. So I'm going to go, I don't know if I have a client packet. Yes, I do. So I have a class specifically dedicated to client packets. You can, of course, just do this in your client initializer. There's literally no difference. So I'm going to go down here. As you can see, I've already got a few. Client-side packet registry, we're going to register. That means intercept any packets with this identifier. So matrix bomb entity.spawn packet. So when any packet is sent to the client that has this ID, it's going to call what we set up here in this little function here. It gives us context about the packet and the packet itself. Now, as you can see up here, I'm kind of just copying what I did earlier. We're going to read the X, Y, and Z position of the packet. And this comes from, so right here, we do write X, write Y, and then write Z. So it goes, this is read first, and then this is read, and then this is read. So we get 1, 2, 3. By the way, you can't read the same value more than once. That will cause spooky issues, so make sure you're only reading one value once. Int entity ID packet read int, and then we have a UUID coming in, packet read UUID. And now inside the task queue, so basically what we're doing here is switching threads, because this right here is in the network thread. We want to switch, I believe, to the main thread. We're going to create a matrix bomb entity. That's our projectile. And I want to pass in, so up here what I did was I set the ID and UUID manually, but what I can also do is create a client-only constructor. So I'm going to say, I'm going to get rid of this entity type here. We're going to take in a world, a vec3d, no, we'll just do, no reason to complicate things. Entity type, I'm going to pass up my matrix bomb entity. The reason we don't do that here is mostly so we can method reference when we register the entity. And there's a couple of other reasons, but you can just leave this entity type as a parameter. Doesn't really matter. Then we're going to say, let me double check. There's a special method you need to call for setting positions here. I don't think it's set, yeah, update position. And update position calls set pos, and then it refreshes its bounding box. You might not actually have to do that, but we're going to say set ID, set UUID. Okay. We've got a client-only constructor, and I'm even going to mark this like, don't use that on the server. Now we can pass in X. Actually, we need a world. I guess I don't need to save it. I can just pass this in here. Okay, that will spawn our entity, and then we need to actually add the entity to the world. There's also spawn entity. I'm not sure what the difference is, to be honest. And you want the entity ID. Okay. So now on the server, this here is called when the server goes, no, excuse me, we're on the client. The server goes, hey, this entity just spawned. This triggers. We read the X, Y, and Z position as well as this data about the entity. and then we spawn the entity into the world. That, quite honestly, I feel like I'm forgetting something, but that should be it. Let's see if this works. Nope. Oh, yes. So, for some reason, I'm not entirely sure why, when you create another constructor, you have to specify the generics down here. So, you do diamond brackets before the create call, but like after the period, and then you specify the entity. So, matrix bomb entity, and now it'll stop complaining. I know generics, but I don't know generics that much. Like, I can't explain why that's happening, but you're basically just specifying the type. There actually is one other thing we need to do. Of course, I knew there was something. We actually have to do item logic here, but to start, I should be able to... Yep, you can see that. Looks like for some reason it is instantly disappearing. I might have an idea as to why that is, but first, I'm going to go over here. I ran the game in debug mode, so I can actually just hot swap this. I'm going to say matrix bomb entity, create a new one. What is the method to initialize a projectile? Set properties. I'm going to set the user, and then we need pitch, yaw, roll, and then two values. So user.get, actually it's a field. User.yaw, roll doesn't matter. These two here, I don't know why they're named this way. It's speed and then divergence. So it's going to be a little bit slower than snowballs. Snowballs are 1.5. This is going to be 1. And then divergence is when you get a bow. Oops. When you get a bow and you shoot at something, you can it's kind of hard to see at close range. Let's see if snowballs... There's a little bit of variance in where the snowballs go. That's divergence. So the more divergence you have, like if you set it really high and you threw snowballs this way, you'd have some going like up here. So I'm going to say maybe 0.1. And now I'm going to spawn the entity into the world. And this should spawn the entity. Yes, it's one of the position methods like this. I just don't know which one it is. Actually, I should probably just look at one of my other entity classes here. This one is update tracked position. This is why I mentioned earlier I was trying to find the right method to call, because I knew that it's kind of confusing, because there's a lot of update position methods. Now if I spawn this, as you can see, it is properly storing the position now, which means I'm going to go back to my testing spot up here. Let's see if this works. This is still not working, but we are able to summon our TNT guys. I want to check if this is colliding. Nope, it's not. Alright. Let's look back at our item class here. Matrix bomb entity. For some reason it's not... Let me make sure this is telling the client that it... Okay, it is. Is it despawning for some reason? Let me check its tick method here. No. Why are there... Okay, I'm gonna kill all the existing entities. I'm not sure why that's ticking. There shouldn't be any... Okay. So, summon. Is our position... Our position is right. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some reason we're at 0, 0, 0 again. Yep. Oh, I know what the issue is. I was under the impression set properties set the entity position from the owner, but that is not the case. Pretty easy to debug, as you saw. I just waited and looked at the position, noticed it was at 0, 0, 0. Now, the next issue is that for some reason they're clipping through blocks. Looks like you have to specify what happens when you hit a block, which works. I'm going to close my game here because I won't be able to hot reload this. So we've got a onCollision method. Actually, onCollision should be called for entities and blocks. So I don't think I need to specify entity hit stuff. So onCollision, we call super, which, yes, okay, so that calls on entity hit or on block hit. So if you want to specify, like, if this hits an entity, deal damage. Otherwise, regardless of what it hits, cause an explosion. That's where you'd use on block hit or on entity hit. Here, we're just going to do this. So on the server, looks like we're sending a status, which is probably get rid of me to the client. I am going to create explosion. I assume the first parameter is the causing entity. Then we've got get X, get Y, get Z, power. Let's say 3. I think 4 is TNT. And then destruction type specifies, like, should it break blocks or not? And in this case, I think I want to... Do I want stuff to drop or not? I'm leaning towards no. This should... Hey! Happy that worked. So as you can see, when our entity is colliding with a block here, that method is triggered and it summons an explosion at the position it lands at. And do I have peaceful on? If I hit an Enderman, it should explode as well, midair. Yep, nice. And of course, you can specify, like, if you don't want it to be a floating piece of TNT, you could change that. Another thing you could do is here, I'm going to push the stack and then pop the stack. And inside here, I'm going to, let's see, vector 3f, positive y. I want radial. I'm going to do math dot, well, I'm going to do this, which should make the entity spin when you throw it. See that? So we're using the entity age as the parameter for the rotation that the entity makes every tick. It looks kind of cool. And matrix.push and pop, that's basically just like save points. If I remove pop, honestly the game will probably crash. Yeah. In some cases, if you forget to pop, what happens is like other stuff is affected. So like I rotate my entity and everything else is rotated. Like creepers are rotated. So save, get rid of my changes, do the rotation. Hope this helped someone. Thanks for watching, and let me know if there's anything else that you'd like to see me cover. Adios.